What would a waiter like you know about business? Or even about language? The words cracked across the glittering ballroom like a whip. For a moment, the chandeliers above seemed to tremble with the echo of Mr. Zhao Liang's voice. The Chinese billionaire leaned back in his velvet chair, smirking, as if the insult were a clever toast. Around him, crystal glasses clinked nervously and laughter bubbled, hesitant at first, then bolder, until the room filled with the uneasy chorus of people who didn't want to be the only ones not laughing. The Rosewood Imperial Hotel's gala was meant to be an evening of prestige. Silk gowns brushed marble floors, tuxedos gleamed, and the world's most powerful investors dined on porcelain plates trimmed with gold. Deals worth billions floated in the air, disguised as casual conversations. But in that polished room, the focus shifted from balance sheets and boardrooms to one young man holding a silver tray. Elijah Brooks, 24 years old, stood still as the insult settled over him. A tall black waiter with shoulders squared from years of carrying weight far heavier than champagne bottles, he lowered his eyes out of habit, not shame. His lips pressed into a quiet line, his silence more controlled than the nervous chuckles that flickered around him. No one there knew that behind that silence lived a sharp mind and a gift the room could not imagine. Zhao Liang, famed for clawing his way up from factory floors to skyscraper offices, was admired for his business empire and feared for his cruelty. He relished moments like this, public dominance dressed up as humor. His gaze swept the room, daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. Instead, they sipped their wine, whispered behind manicured hands, and waited to see how far the humiliation would go. "Come now," Zhao added, switching to Mandarin with a flourish, his words sharp and mocking. "Do you even understand what we say? Or is English already too much for you?" The investors at his table chuckled louder. A few raised their phones, recording the spectacle like it was free entertainment. In that crystal-lit hall, arrogance became amusement, and dignity was a game to be played at the expense of someone unseen, someone expected to remain silent. Elijah's hand tightened on the tray, but his face remained calm, unreadable. His silence wasn't weakness, it was patience. Behind him, another waiter muttered under his breath, "Don't respond, not worth it." But Elijah didn't need the warning. He'd been here before, in different forms, countless times. The laughter swelled. Zhao Liang smirked triumphantly, his cruelty feeding off the crowd's complicity. And then the narrator's voice slipped in, low and steady, cutting through the haze of mockery. They laughed because they thought it was a joke, but when Elijah opened his mouth, in flawless Mandarin, their laughter turned to silence. Elijah Brooks had always carried two worlds inside him. The first was visible to everyone, the one of a young black man in a starched white shirt, bow tie tight at the neck, serving cocktails and canapes to people who barely noticed his face. That world was heavy with bills, with his mother's exhaustion after endless double shifts at the hospital, and with the quiet expectation that he should be grateful for scraps of opportunity. The second world was his secret, one no one at the Rosewood Imperial Hotel could imagine. It was built of words that twisted like music, characters that looked like art, tones that could change a meaning with the smallest shift of sound. Mandarin Chinese had become Elijah's sanctuary and his rebellion all at once, a language he had chosen for himself, one that had chosen him back. He'd been 15 when he stumbled upon it. The neighborhood library was clearing old shelves, tossing out tattered books into a cardboard box labeled "Free." Buried under chemistry manuals and broken-spine dictionaries, Elijah had pulled out a book of basic Mandarin. The characters looked like strokes of lightning across paper. He remembered clutching it to his chest on the walk home, as though it were treasure. That night, under the flicker of a candle, the electricity had been cut off again, he began whispering strange syllables into the darkness. What started as curiosity became obsession. He copied characters on scraps of paper. He biked to Chinatown just to listen to vendors talk, mimicking their tones until the words began to feel natural on his tongue. Online, he hunted down free lectures, watching professors in Beijing explain. economics and history in a language most Americans thought impossible to master. Elijah would pause, rewind, repeat, his mouth moving along until he owned each word. His mother, Denise, would often find him at dawn, asleep at the kitchen table, with pages of notes scattered like fallen leaves around him. She never scolded. She only smoothed his hair and whispered, "Your grandma used to say, 'Respect yourself in silence. One day the world will hear you loud. Keep going, baby.'" Elijah kept going. By 18, while most of his classmates struggled with basics, Spanish, he was chatting with Chinese tourists in flawless Mandarin, offering directions or recommendations with a shy smile. Once, at a Chinatown cafe, he gently corrected a translation on a menu that had mixed up the words for beef and noodles. The owner had stared, then laughed, amazed at the tall teenager with perfect tones. But outside those moments, Elijah never showed off. His gift was something he held close, waiting. Meanwhile, his family lived on the edge. Denise's nursing wages covered rent but barely stretched to groceries and Elijah's younger siblings' school supplies. When the fridge was nearly empty, Elijah would pick up extra shifts at the hotel, trading hours of sleep for tips that kept the lights on. He lived in a body tired from double lives, waiter by night, self-taught linguist by day. Yet he carried himself with a quiet dignity that unnerved those who tried to belittle him. Unlike the swagger of men who measured worth in dollars, Elijah's strength was measured in patience. That patience would be tested when it collided with the arrogance of men like Zhao Liang. Zhao's story was legendary in business circles. Born poor in rural China, he clawed his way to wealth through factories and steel, building an empire brick by brick. But with power came disdain. He believed respect was earned only through status, through showing others their smallness. Where Elijah's grandmother had taught him humility, Zhao had learned dominance. Where Elijah's mother had taught sacrifice, Zhao had embraced cruelty. The contrast between them could not have been sharper. In quiet corners of the hotel, Elijah sometimes overheard executives struggling with Chinese investors, fumbling through translation apps that mangled meaning. He'd bite his tongue, resisting the urge to help. He'd learned that stepping out of place often meant punishment. Once, at a previous job, he'd assisted a lost Chinese family by translating directions. His manager had pulled him aside and hissed, "Don't act above your role. Customers don't like when staff pretend to be clever." That wound stayed with him, pushing him to hide his brilliance under the disguise of invisibility. Still, there were glimpses. He once helped a tourist couple find their way when their taxi driver was confused. He occasionally corrected a mistranslation on a guest's phone. These small acts kept his flame alive. But no one at the Rosewood saw more than a waiter. No one, until Zhao Liang decided to make him an example. The cruel irony was that Elijah's years of silence, those nights of candlelight study, those hours of practicing characters until his hand was cramped, were about to erupt in a single moment. The guests thought they were watching a boy about to be humiliated. What they didn't know was that Elijah had been preparing his whole life for the moment arrogance finally demanded he speak. The chandeliers of the Rosewood Imperial glimmered like frozen fire, throwing shards of light across tables set with crystal glasses and silver cutlery. The evening was meant to impress. Investors from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia all gathered in a ballroom where millions in future deals hovered in the air like perfume. And yet, the sharpest scent wasn't of roses or champagne. It was arrogance. Zhao Liang leaned back in his chair, the tailored lines of his charcoal suit pulling smoothly as though custom stitched for the posture of disdain. His lips curved into a smirk as he gestured lazily at Elijah Brooks, who stood beside the table with a tray of wine. "Do you even understand what we're discussing?" Zhao's voice sliced across the polished table, sharp enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Perhaps you should stick to serving wine. That's all. Someone like you could grasp." A ripple of uneasy laughter followed. Some guests chuckled because they thought they should, others because they didn't want Zhao's eyes turning on them next. A few, their smiles strained, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They watched. Elijah closely, waiting for his reaction, as though humiliation were a sport with predictable moves. But Elijah didn't flinch. He held the tray steady, the crystal stems rattling faintly only from the tremor of the air conditioner, not his hand. His dark eyes dropped in a gesture that seemed deferential, but the silence behind them was not weakness. It was composure. That composure unsettled Zhao. He leaned forward, elbows pressing into the linen as though Elijah were a puzzle that needed breaking. "You bring us wine, you clear our plates," Zhao sneered, his Mandarin-accented English dripping with contempt. "But business, culture, these are things above you." Again, the chuckles rose. Phones tilted discreetly, recording. One guest whispered, "He's enjoying this too much." Another murmured, "It's cruel," but no one stopped him. Elijah's chest rose and fell once, controlled. He had endured worse. Every insult he had ever swallowed. At job interviews, at supermarkets, in classrooms where teachers underestimated him, had taught him that silence could be both armor and weapon. But Zhao wasn't finished. Switching fluidly to Mandarin, Zhao delivered his next blow, assuming no one beyond his circle of investors would catch a word. His voice dropped just enough to carry to those who mattered, but not enough to hide from staff standing nearby. "Americans know only money," Zhao said, the tones crisp and deliberate. "Never culture. Look at him, a servant. They will never understand refinement." This time the laughter was sharper, unguarded. The Mandarin had cloaked the cruelty in foreign syllables, making it safer for the guests to indulge. They thought the words had vanished into the air, lost on the boy with the tray, but Elijah understood every syllable. The years of candlelight study, the long nights of repeating tones until his voice cracked, the afternoons in Chinatown cafes. All of it had prepared him for this moment. Zhao's insult landed not as a wound, but as a spark. The words rang in Elijah's mind with perfect clarity, igniting something he had held back for years. Mrs. Chen, seated across from Zhao, tilted her head. A billionaire investor from Singapore with a reputation for valuing character above wealth, she had been watching Elijah closely. Where others saw a servant swallowing shame, she saw stillness like water held behind a dam. Her eyes narrowed, and her hand stilled on her wine glass. She was waiting. At the edge of the ballroom, two fellow waiters leaned close, whispering urgently as Elijah refilled their trays. "Don't risk it," one murmured, barely moving his lips. "He's powerful. They'll fire you if you answer back. Just let it go," another urged. "It's not worth it." Elijah didn't respond. He kept his face calm, but inside the pressure built. His grandmother's voice echoed as it had so many times before. "Respect yourself in silence. One day the world will hear you loud." Tonight, the silence was louder than words. Each time Zhao mocked him, the weight in Elijah's chest grew heavier. Each chuckle from the guests became another stone pressing down, and Mrs. Chen kept watching. The laughter swelled once more, cruel and unrestrained. Zhao leaned back, satisfied, with the amusement he had drawn. "See?" he said, still in Mandarin. "They have nothing to say. Empty, like their culture, like their futures." The room buzzed, glasses clinked, and the musicians in the corner struck up a waltz. But over the glittering music, there was something else. The heavy, deliberate silence of a man making a decision. Elijah adjusted the tray in his hands, his gaze lifting at last. For a fleeting second, his eyes locked with Mrs. Chen's across the room. She gave no nod, no encouragement. But in her gaze, he saw recognition, the first sign that perhaps breaking the silence wouldn't mean falling alone. The air shifted. The laughter was still ringing, but something heavier was coming. No one in that glittering ballroom realized it yet. But the moment Zhao chose to cloak his insult in Mandarin, he had handed Elijah the very weapon that would undo him. And Elijah was about to use it. The laughter had gone on too long. Each sneer from Zhao Liang was a needle, each chuckle from the gilded tables another reminder that money could purchase applause, but not respect. Elijah Brooks, balancing the tray with one hand, stood at the periphery of the gala like a shadow carved into the marble, And then Zhao leaned forward again. His voice, smooth as silk and sharp as a blade, came in Mandarin, deliberately slower this time, making sure every syllable landed. "Even if you studied for 100 years," Zhao said, smiling like a cat toying with a mouse, "you would still be nothing more than a servant polishing glasses for men who matter." The words sank into the air like a toxin. Around the table, guests smirked, not all of them understanding, but catching enough from Zhao's tone to laugh along. It was the breaking point. Elijah inhaled once, a breath that felt like it carried not only his lungs but every late night with grammar books, every whispered tone practiced in Chinatown cafes, every prayer his mother made over bills at the kitchen table. He set the tray down gently, the glasses clinking like the toll of a bell. When he looked up, his voice came out calm, steady as stone. "In all respect, sir," Elijah said, in flawless Mandarin. His tones were clear, his pronunciation precise, his delivery elegant. "I understand every word, and you are wrong." The room froze. Gasps rippled like a wave crashing across marble. Forks stopped mid-air. Champagne flutes tilted dangerously in unsteady hands. One guest dropped his phone with a clatter, another fumbled, nearly spilling wine into his lap. The laughter that had seemed so endless shattered into silence. Zhao's smirk evaporated. "You," he stammered, also in Mandarin. "You speak?" Elijah's lips curved into a small dignified smile. "I don't just speak," he replied smoothly. "I have listened, for years, to words of contempt, to arrogance disguised as wisdom. And tonight I answer, not to shame you, but to remind you, respect belongs to everyone." The stillness was electric. Zhao recovered quickly, his pride flaring. He narrowed his eyes, and with a flick of his wrist threw out a test, a twisting idiom about painting a tiger's skin but not its bones, a saying used to expose pretenders. His voice was confident, daring Elijah to falter. But Elijah didn't. Without hesitation, he countered with a proverb older than dynasties. His tones lilted with ease. "Yu bu zhuo, bu cheng qi." Jade, if not carved, cannot become a gem. He let the words hang, their implication clear. The crowd inhaled sharply. Even those who didn't understand Mandarin felt the weight of poetry in his cadence. Zhao tried again, layering his speech with technical jargon from finance, legal clauses, obscure dialect references. But Elijah met each one calmly, answering with precision, weaving cultural metaphors that drew murmurs of admiration from Chinese guests. At last, he quoted Confucius himself, "San ren xing, bu wo shi yan." In the company of three, there is always something to learn. His gaze locked with Zhao's, as he added softly, "But only if one has the humility to listen." The ballroom erupted in a collective gasp. Zhao's face, once flushed with the confidence of cruelty, burned crimson. His hands clenched the edge of the tablecloth as though the linen could anchor him. And then came the sound. Soft at first, deliberate, undeniable. Clap, clap, clap. Mrs. Chen, still and regal in her silk gown, had raised her hands in applause. Her eyes glowed with approval, her lips curved in something between satisfaction and vindication. The clapping grew louder. Another investor joined, then another. Within seconds, the hall was filled with applause, echoing under the chandeliers like thunder rolling over marble. Zhao sat frozen, suffocating in humiliation. Elijah let the noise rise, then lifted his hand slightly, and the room quieted. His voice was measured, not loud, but it carried. "Language is not owned by money," he said, first in Mandarin, then in English, ensuring every corner of the hall was understood. "Respect is the only universal currency." The line struck like lightning. For the first time all evening, the guests weren't laughing. They were leaning forward, listening, and then Elijah delivered the final blow. His tone sharpened as he translated Zhao's earlier insult into English for the entire room to hear. "This man said," Elijah repeated, his words steady, "that I would always be nothing more than a servant, that Americans know only money, and never culture, that I and people like me do not belong." The silence was suffocating. No cough, no clink of cutlery, only the truth, laid bare in words Zhao could no longer hide behind. Zhao's associates shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding his gaze, others glaring at him in quiet disgust. A few guests shook their heads, murmuring under their breath. Elijah bowed his head slightly, not to Zhao, but to the room. "Respect yourselves," he said softly, once more in both Mandarin and English. "Because without it, wealth is nothing but an empty shell." The applause thundered again, shaking the air like a storm. Zhao Liang, for all his billions, sat in silence. Small, humiliated, his power dissolved in the face of dignity he had tried to destroy. And in that ballroom, everyone knew. The waiter had not just replied in Mandarin, he had rewritten the balance of respect. The applause hadn't even faded when Zhao Liang tried to salvage himself. His lips twitched, searching for words, but all that came out was a stammer, broken Mandarin phrases, clumsy English interjections. The billionaire who had owned the room minutes ago was now shrinking under its gaze. His arrogance cracked like glass under pressure. His associates leaned back in their chairs, no longer aligned with his sneers. Their silence was damning. "Guests," whispered openly now. He thought it was a joke, but the joke was on him. Unbelievable. The waiter speaks better Mandarin than Zhao himself. I'll never look at him the same way again. The man who had built his fortune on intimidating deals had lost the only currency that mattered here, respect. And at the center of the storm, Elijah Brooks stood calmly, his tray set aside, his hands folded in front of him. His silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was power. Mrs. Chen, the Singaporean investor whose applause had sparked the reversal, rose from her seat. Her silk gown shimmered under the chandeliers as she crossed the floor, each step commanding attention. She stopped in front of Elijah and extended her hand. "Your skill," she said in accented but clear English, "belongs in boardrooms, not back rooms." Then, switching seamlessly into Mandarin, she added, "Our company is expanding into the U.S. market. We could use someone who understands both our language and our dignity." Gasps rippled again, but this time they were full of admiration, not mockery. Elijah shook her hand with quiet grace, his voice steady. "Thank you, ma'am. Respect is the bridge we all need." Behind them, the hotel manager, Harrison, looked like he'd swallowed broken glass. His face was pale, his jaw stiff. Investors leaned toward one another, whispering, "How is someone like this wasted as a waiter? Unforgivable. Blind leadership. The hotel doesn't deserve him." One even muttered loudly enough for Harrison to hear, "If this is how they overlook talent, imagine what else they miss." The words struck like daggers. Harrison's eyes flicked from Zhao, humiliated and sweating, to Elijah, radiant and unexpected. Triumph. The contrast was brutal. The downfall of arrogance and the rise of dignity, all in the same hall. Elijah felt his phone buzz against his hip. In the corner of the ballroom, during the stir of voices, he slipped it from his pocket. A text to his mother. Short, simple, but heavy with meaning. "They finally saw me tonight." The reply came within seconds, as though she had been waiting all her life for this message. "Baby, they didn't just see you, they saw the truth." For a moment, the noise of the ballroom faded. Elijah stood taller, as though the weight of years spent studying by candlelight, working double shifts, carrying trays while carrying dreams, had finally lifted. His mother's words grounded him. This victory wasn't just his. It belonged to her, to his siblings, to every quiet sacrifice that had brought him here. As the evening drew to a close, the narrative of the gala had shifted entirely. It was no longer about Zhao's wealth or his power plays. It was about the black waiter who spoke flawless Mandarin, who had dismantled arrogance with calm dignity. Zhao exited the ballroom like a wounded general retreating from a lost war, his head bowed, his empire of fear temporarily irrelevant. Harrison slinked after him, praying the investors wouldn't pin the night's humiliation entirely on him, but murmurs followed. The manager didn't even know the talent he had in front of him. Blindness like that costs millions. Meanwhile, Elijah lingered near the back, not seeking the spotlight but unable to escape it. Several guests approached, offering business cards, words of praise, even apologies. One older gentleman said, "Young man, you didn't just translate language tonight, you translated dignity." And as the glittering crowd slowly dispersed, the story of the night was already being written, not in Zhao's voice, not in Harrison's polished reports, but in whispers, in videos already spreading online, in investors' conversations on the way back to their cars. The boy they had overlooked, the waiter they had mocked, had become the center of gravity. Dignity had won. The gala ended, but its echo never stopped. What began as a moment of humiliation for one man and revelation for another rippled outward into a story that touched millions. By morning, the video was everywhere. A 30-second clip captured it all. Zhao Liang leaning back with arrogance, mocking Elijah in Mandarin, followed by the young black waiter's calm, flawless reply. The look on Zhao's face, disbelief melting into humiliation, was replayed millions of times. The caption, written by the first guest who posted it, read simply, "Respect speaks all languages." Within hours, it became a global trend. Respect speaks all languages. Spread across Twitter, TikTok, and news outlets worldwide. Commentators marveled. A billionaire mocked a waiter and was undone by his ignorance. Educators shared the clip as an example of cultural intelligence. Parents showed it to their children as a lesson in humility. For the first time, Elijah Brooks's years of study, struggle, and silence were not invisible. They were celebrated. Opportunities poured in. Companies contacted him with offers to serve as a cultural advisor. Universities reached out, asking him to speak about language learning and perseverance. Mrs. Chen, true to her word, formalized her offer and brought Elijah on as a consultant. For her firm's expansion into America, for Elijah, it wasn't just a new job. It was a doorway. Within a year, Elijah launched his own international consulting firm, specializing in cross-cultural communication. His expertise bridged boardrooms from New York to Beijing, yet he never forgot where he came from. Remembering long nights when he studied by candlelight, he started offering free Mandarin classes for underprivileged kids in his neighborhood. "If I can learn this," he told them, "so can you. Language isn't about privilege, it's about perseverance." The contrast with Zhao's fate could not have been sharper. Once a figure of untouchable power, Zhao Liang became a symbol of arrogance undone. His associates, eager to preserve their reputations, began distancing themselves. Business partners canceled contracts quietly. Online, he was mocked mercilessly. Memes of his shocked expression spread with captions like, "Money can't buy respect." At conferences, whispers followed him. Isn't he the one who got schooled by a waiter? Even Zhao's peers in the business world, who once admired his bravado, began using him as a cautionary tale. "Don't pull a Zhao" became shorthand for underestimating people you consider beneath you. His empire survived financially, but his influence, the aura of intimidation that once carried him, was shattered. At the Rosewood Imperial Hotel, where it all began, the management couldn't escape scrutiny either. Harrison, the manager, who had stood by while Elijah was mocked, was forced to face the board. Investors questioned him bluntly. "How did you not know the skills of your own staff?" The embarrassment triggered a complete overhaul. Within months, the hotel launched the Hidden Talents Initiative, a program designed to uncover the skills, education, and languages of staff members often overlooked. They discovered housekeepers with law degrees, bellhops fluent in multiple languages, cooks who held advanced certifications in nutrition. The hotel shifted its culture, learning the hard way that brilliance isn't always dressed in a suit. Elijah, though no longer working, there was invited back to advise the program. Standing in front of the very staff who had once urged him to stay quiet, he told them, "You are not invisible. Your skills, your intelligence, your dignity, they matter. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." Applause filled the staff. Hall, not out of obligation, but out of shared pride. The world kept telling and retelling his story. News anchors referred to Elijah as the waiter who spoke truth in Mandarin. Bloggers called him a modern-day David versus Goliath. But Elijah himself remained grounded. In interviews, when asked what the moment meant to him, he answered simply, "It meant the world finally listened to what I already knew, that respect is the only universal language." And so the legacy of that night lived on, not as the tale of a billionaire's cruelty, but of a young man's dignity. A story that reminded the world to look twice, to listen deeply, to never mistake a uniform for the limits of a person's worth. Elijah had not just corrected a billionaire. He had rewritten the rhythm of power. They laughed when a billionaire mocked a black waiter. They chuckled into champagne glasses, smirked behind crystal cutlery, believing arrogance would always have the last word. But the laughter died when Elijah Brooks raised his head and answered in flawless Mandarin, a truth spoken in a language money could never own. That night was not about wealth or status. It was about dignity refusing to be erased. The billionaire thought he was measuring power, but what he revealed was weakness. And the young man they dismissed as the help revealed the strength of discipline, perseverance, and respect. Because true intelligence is not loud arrogance. It is quiet humility. True wealth is not found in bank accounts, but in respect that endures when applause fades. And true downfall is arrogance exposed, stripped bare under the weight of its own cruelty. Elijah's story is not just his own. It is a reminder to every person who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, or mocked. Dignity has a voice, and one day the world will hear it. If this story moved you, subscribe for more stories of Black excellence, social justice, and the dignity that silences arrogance.